Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first let's talk about Ukraine. The Russians during the previous night carried out another massive missile and drone strike. Lots of explosions were recorded. This morning pro-Ukrainian resources published this picture where we can see the approximate routes of Russian attack. Here we can see lots of yellow lines, which means that the Russians once again used hundreds of drones. And here we can see lots of red lines, which means that the Russians also use cruise missiles. As you can see, according to this map, the Russians attacked just 5 cities. The Russians attacked the cities of Kharkiv, Kiev, Lutsk, Lvov, and Chernivtsi. So the Russians attacked the eastern Ukraine, the central Ukraine, and the most powerful damage was dealt to the western part of Ukraine. So when talking about every single city, the Russians were attacking different targets. For example, when talking about Kharkiv, the mayor stated that the Russians attack the city with 10 strikes, 2 FABs, and 8 drones. The targets were a critical infrastructure facility, an industrial plant, and warehouses. After the hits, large fire broke out in the city. Thick smoke rises over the area of the strikes. Slaviansk, 4 landings were recorded near the bus station. Chernivtsi explosions were also recorded. Lutsk, a strike was carried out on the motor aircraft repair plant. Another area that the Russians attacked heavily was the city of Lvov. Here we also got lots of videos, lots of pictures that confirm Russian attack. Massive strike on Lvov. Electron plant was hit. Last night a massive strike with missiles and drones was carried out on objects in western Ukraine. Explosions and a large-scale fire were recorded in Lviv. Clouds of smoke and rising over the city, confirmed the mayor. Local publics report the destruction of the Electron Corporation building previously associated with defense production. So as you can see, the Russians continue their massive missile and drone strikes all over the entire territory of Ukraine. Just yesterday or the day before yesterday, the Russians attacked the city of Kiev. Now the Russians attack the entire territory of Ukraine. Most likely during the next night, the Russians will attack Ukraine once again. But I would like to remind you that on Monday, Keith Kellogg, the special envoy of the United States of America, is going to come to Ukraine, and he is going to serve as an air defense system, most likely, which will reduce the number of Russian strikes. And he's going to stay in Ukraine for another week. But until Monday, we still have 2 nights, which means that the Russians will try to use these 2 nights as much as possible. Furthermore, Zelensky stated that U.S. arms flow is back on. Supply has been restored. Should U.S. So this is the situation. So despite the fact that the Russians are attacking, we see that Ukraine will start getting and receiving weapons from the United States of America, which most likely will stabilize at least a little bit the situation in the sky. Now let's talk about the situation on the ground, and first let's talk about the Sumo direction, where both the Russians and the Ukrainians continue their offensive operation. The Russian sources reported that during the previous 12 hours they managed to secure the forest to the east of the settlement of Yunakivka. So currently the Russians control everything to the northeast of this red line. Furthermore, the sources, pro-Russian resources and pro-Ukrainian resources, this morning confirmed that Ukrainians abandoned their positions in the village of Yunakivka completely. So the Russians are finishing the clearing operation, and according to several resources, these coming days, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will confirm complete control over this territory, and we will color the village of Yunakivka completely under Russian control. At the same time, the Ukrainians continue their attempts to counterattack the Russians in the area of the village of Kondratovka, but when talking about this area, the Russians are bombing and attacking these positions of the armed forces of Ukraine with FABs. So the situation remains tense for Ukrainians. They're trying to show that they are able to restore control over lost positions, but we see that they can't do anything, at least in this direction. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kharkiv direction. Very interesting updates are coming from this area. The Russians a month ago probably began their another offensive operation, and as a result of clashes during the previous first days of offensive operation in this area, the Russians managed to secure the village of Milova and forest belt around. And this morning we got another video, this time published by the Ukrainian sources, and in this video we can see how Ukrainians of 3rd Tank Brigade were counterattacking Russians along this tree line. This tree line was geolocated, and this is exactly the place where Ukrainians were counterattacking. Ukrainians were attacking this tree line, trying to destroy as many as possible Russian soldiers there. So this video was geolocated, and this is exactly a place where Ukrainians were counterattacking Russians. And based on this video, most of the mappers adjusted their maps. So as you can see, according to this geolocation, currently the Russians are trying to get as close as possible to the settlement of Khatny, and most likely the Russians are going to attack this village first, and then they will move further in the northern, southern and the western direction. So the settlement of Khatny is the primary task for the Russians during this stage of their offensive operation in the northeastern part of the Kharkiv Oblast. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Leman direction, where the Russians another day in a row continue their offensive operation. During the previous night, according to different mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions once again. The Russians secured these, let's say, true lines and these fields, and the Russians managed to get as close as possible to the river of Nitrios from the east. So these are the changes, and let's compare the map between the dates. This is the situation by the end of the 11th of July of 2025. And this is the situation by the beginning of the 12th of July. So these fields were completely secured, and as you can see, the Russians are trying to outflank the settlement of Kolodisi from behind and to cut supply of the settlement, which will allow the Russians to take this village also under complete control in coming days. Now let's discuss the situation in the Konstantinivka direction. Currently, the most fierce clashes are taking place for the southeastern part of the Kleban-Bukski pocket. We are talking about the territory between the villages of Novospaska, Sherbinovka, Katerinovka, Kleban-Buk and Nilipovka. There are very heavy clashes, and if you take a look at this configuration of the front line, we see that there are at least 2 or 3 pockets were created. This is, for example, a first pocket we're talking about. The Ukrainians in this area obviously feel themselves not very good, not very comfortable. This is another pocket in this area, also controlled by the armored forces of Ukraine. And we can say about the most northern pockets, the territory along the river of Krivoy Tarets and to the south of Katerinovka and Kleban-Bek. And the Russians are currently trying to establish complete control over these territories. According to different mappers, according to neutral mappers and pro-Russian resources, the Russians are trying to attack this area at least from 3 directions. The Russians are trying to attack in the direction of Novospaska. This can allow the Russians to cut some Kodron Ukrainians in the most southeastern pocket. The Russians are attacking the same pocket from the east, from the city of Taretsk, and the Russians are trying to answer the southwestern part of the settlement of Katerinovka. So the Russians are trying to cut this territory in many pieces to cut Ukrainian cauldrons, and I would like to remind you that at least this area used to be under control and responsibilities of the 12th Azov Special Purpose Brigade. So we don't know for sure whether this 12th brigade is still there. Maybe they evacuated and they were replaced by someone else. We don't know for sure, but obviously this is going to be very interesting if the 12th brigade will stay in this direction with the purpose to, let's say, repel Russian attacks. Now let's compare the map between the dates. This is the situation by the end of the 11th of July of 2025, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 12th of July. The most important progress that was recorded is Russian advance in the direction of Katerinovka. We believe that these upcoming weekends are going to be very heavy clashes exactly in this area. Now let's talk about N32 road. So we have additional changes, as you can see, huge ones. This video was published by Ukrainian sources, and in this video, to the south of the settlement of Volodymyrovka, we can see Ukrainian FPV drone attack on Russian soldiers that were moving in this area. So based on this video, most of the mappers adjusted their maps. Now we can compare the maps between the dates. This is the situation at the end of the 11th of July, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 12th of July. Based on this video, we came to the conclusion that the Russians managed to secure a dense network of fortifications in this area, and the Russians are trying to answer this true line, and this true line will allow the Russians to move further in the northwestern direction towards the settlement of Novotaretska and Volodymyrovka, accordingly from the north and from the south. Now let's move further and let's talk the situation, discuss the situation in the South Donetsk or in the Dnipropetrovsk direction. The Russians continue their offensive, and we are waiting for additional updates exactly from this area. The most important video is coming from the settlement of Novokhatskaya. This video was published by the Ukrainian sources, and in this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians in the northwestern part of the settlement. Here we can see Russian soldiers that were taking positions in another building, and this building was also destroyed by Ukrainians. So this episode took place exactly in this point, and based on this video we came to the conclusion that the Russians decided to attack Novokhatskaya not from the south or not from the east. The Russians decided to attack this village in the direction of the northwestern part, and this allowed the Russians to cut these Ukrainians who are currently in Koldron and to cut supply between Novokhatskaya and Zeleny Gai. At the same time, several pro-Russian resources reported that the village of Grushevskaya also was taken by the Russians by the morning of the 12th of July of 2025. So we are waiting for additional report published by Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, where we can see all these confirmations. Furthermore, today we got additional changes in the area of the settlement of Mirne. Basically, according to different mappers, this village by the morning of the 12th of July of 2025 was taken by the Russians completely. Furthermore, several pro-Russian resources reported that the Russians also answered the village of Voskresenka and forced Ukrainians to fall back further in the western direction. According to several very reliable pro-Russian resources, by the morning of the 12th of July of 2025, the Russians established control for more than 50% of the settlement, and they continue advancing, which means that by the end of the day, they can secure the village of Voskresenka completely. Now let's talk about the Zaporizhzhia direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. We have another geolocation in the southern part of Plavny. In this video we can see how Ukrainians were attacking Russians with FPV drones. So this building that was attacked by the Ukrainians was geolocated exactly in this point, and based on this video, as you can see, we have adjusted the southern part of the settlement. At the same time, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the northern direction. We have lots of videos, lots of episodes how the Russians were bombing and attacking the settlements of Stepnogorsk, Novodanilovka and Plavny with FAPs, with artillery, with aviation. So a lot of episodes were recorded, and which means that the Russians are not going to stop. They're going to, and they're planning to move further in the northern direction with the purpose to get as close as possible to the most important city in this area, the city of Zaporizhzhia. And then using drones, the Russians will try to ruin logistics of the armed forces of Ukraine. The Ukrainians from their side understand everything what is happening here, and they're trying to deal the Russian damage as well. In this video, for example, we can see how Ukrainians using their aircraft were trying to attack and to damage a bridge in the area of the settlement of Vasilievka. This bridge the Russians used to supply and support their forces in the Kamenskaya offensive operation. So in this video we can see how Ukrainians were trying to destroy this bridge. Most likely the bridge was just damaged. I'm not sure that the bridge was destroyed, but obviously this can also lead to some problems with Russian logistics. So as you can see, there are very heavy clashes in this area. Both the Russians and the Ukrainians are using infantry vehicles, tanks, and the most important, aviation. And of course, they're both using drones. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.